Please welcome Dr. I wanted to say Pirate Dove.
Thank you very much. Arr! How's everyone today? Oh, no, the proper response. There we are. Very good. Good to hear. Thank you all for coming out on such a kind of a slick driving day. It's a great turnout. Happy to be here. Thank you very much, Cheryl, for the kind introduction. Just a show of hands, who here has been to Newfoundland before? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Well, then some of you may be familiar, obviously, with some of the place names as well as with some of the individuals and events that will be discussed here today. I was going to say the weather actually reminded me of back home, particularly in the summer. I usually get back I try to get back for a week or two every summer to get out on the water and sample breathe that fresh salt air, and of course sample the rum, right? So in other words, play pirate for a little bit. And with that, I want to start off things. Might as well keep the laughter going, I suppose. With that, whoops, I think I ruined it. There we go. With a joke. What did the pirate exclaim when a ship hit an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland? There we go. Shiver me timbers. Little help there from my 11-year-old son on that one. Very gracious. Thank you very much for that. Today I want to focus on the time period many refer to as the golden age of piracy, okay? And that would take place anywhere between the early 17th century, so 1610s and 20s, right up until about the 1720s, and certainly over by 1730. And of course, these are some of the individuals that most of us are familiar with when we think of pirates. So people from left to right, Henry Morgan, Captain Henry Morgan, as well as Captain Kidd, William Kidd there in the middle, and of course, Blackbeard, otherwise known as Edward Teach. These are the three individuals that often come up in terms of studies and as well as courses that mainly deal with the golden age of piracy. And so that's what I'm here to talk about today. Now, these golden age pirates, they were focused mainly on the Spanish and Portuguese treasure fleets, the silver and gold galleons operating between Europe, West Africa, where they would obtain slaves eventually, and then bring them over to the New World, places like Brazil and in South America, where the Portuguese were very active, the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, and of course, this would be referred to as the Spanish Main. And any European vessels that crossed the Lesser Antilles were accused of crossing the line, right? And this line was the line of Tordesillas, Treaty of Tordesillas that the Pope had enacted in 1493, 1494 to keep these two Catholic nations from going to war against each other in the threat, of course, of Muslim expansion. And so what this did was it really ended, again, as you can appreciate, it's between England and Spain. So the rest of Europe, the northern European countries like the Dutch, the French, and the English, for instance, didn't terribly like that idea, they were cut out of the riches of the New World. So their focus would be on the gold and silver shipments that were being moved back and forth annually from the so-called New World back to places Portugal and Spain. So this is the booty that, of course, was the most valued, the most attractive. Why then would Newfoundland be so attractive? Again, it's much further north, much colder. And of course, it also offered very little in terms of gold and silver. So why then would contemporaries end up referring to Newfoundland as a nursery for pirates? Okay. So in Atlantic circles, Newfoundland was known for one thing, right? And that was codfish, right? So why the interest from pirates? This guy's wondering the same thing, I'm sure. That's what I'd like to answer for you here today, okay? We'll tackle that question. We're going to begin with the cod fishery. The international cod fishery that takes root really within a few decades of Giovanni Caboto or John Cabot's voyage to the shores of Newfoundland in the summer of 1497. Within a few decades, you have Spanish, you have Portuguese, you have English and French, as well as Basque fishermen who are sailing across the water every spring to, fish on the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. The Basque would later be into Labrador area, and they would conduct a whale fishery there. So it becomes really an important, a very significant part of the English diet, cod. It feeds Europe for centuries. It's a very high source of protein. And even at the end of the 16th century, it was said that most Europeans, in terms of occupation, next to farming, most Europeans were engaged in the fisheries. So it was very important. And it reflects the importance that that cod fish had in the everyday diet of Europeans. Okay? It was easy to preserve, it was easy to transport, it was easy to preserve as well and purchase and prepare. In terms of, or in times of rising nation states and of course warring nation states, it was an ideal military ration. And again, particularly as the Spanish and Portuguese plantations get off the ground in the New World, and of course African slaves begin to work those plantations, the lowest degree or quality of fish, called refuse fish, would be shipped to the Caribbean and South America, and this fish would be used to feed slave populations. So it becomes a very important commodity, of course, within the early modern world. Furthermore, of course, both Catholic and Protestant churches decree meatless days, and of course they declare fish days in their place for several days of the week. And this, of course, only increases consumption rates among Europeans. National governments also come to regard the fishery in Newfoundland as essential to the training of sailors. And these sailors, of course, would be called on in times of war, right, to man their navies. And so the governments promote fisheries for several reasons. And of course, one of the main reasons is because there are so-called nurseries for seamen, right, for sailors. So how do we move from nurseries of sailors to nurseries of pirates? Well, the development of the island could be largely determined, or would be largely determined, by the demands of the fishery. And that's important to keep in mind in order to understand sort of developments and why piracy sort of ebbs and flows within the province of Newfoundland, the region of Newfoundland, what's now Atlantic Canada, in the early 17th century as well as the early 18th century. We've got to talk about how these nations actually conducted their fisheries. Many of the Iberian countries, Spain, Portugal, but as well as France, conducted what's called a wet fishery. They had natural supplies of salt. Salt, of course, would be used to preserve the fish. They would catch the fish, they would clean them, process them, and salt them in the hold of their vessels. And when that hold was full, for the most part, then they were able to take them directly to market. The English did not have those supplies of salt. They were heavily dependent on imports from various parts of Europe. It was very expensive, of course. So they had to conduct what's known as a dry fishery. In order to conduct a dry fishery, as this image what describes, they had to have shore-based facilities. They actually had to have an area on land where they could go in, land the catch, process it, and then lay it out on flakes, okay, where it would dry in the sun. And of course, in Newfoundland, you're going to need as much time as you can get for that fish to dry properly. But But that being said, that was really the only thing they could do in order to remain competitive with France and those Iberian countries in terms of markets. This, of course, spurs interest in establishing colonies in places like Cupids, which we'll get to soon. Here we go. Cupids or Cooper's Cove, okay? So certainly by the early part of the 17th century, and of course this is also a time when Acadia, right, Port Royal, is being settled by the French in 1604, 1605. Of course, we know the French are also into Quebec by 1608. We know that the Dutch are in New York soon after Henry Hudson's voyage there, also in 1608, 1609. And of course, the English are in Virginia by 1607. So these northern European countries are focused on occupying parts of North America, and this would also allow them to defend, I guess, territorial claims. So they disregarded Spain and Portugal and their claims over this part of the world because they didn't occupy these regions, right? They laid claim to it, but they hadn't discovered these areas and they had no presence. The Dutch, the French, and the English, I think all agreed that you had to actually occupy. You had to have that physical presence in order to lay claim to it. So there's that, but of course there's also, of course, having the actual shore-based facilities in order to conduct their very important dry fishery. So as I say, John Guy establishes Cooper's Cove. He's given a monopoly. What the English Crown does, of course, is they grant companies, chartered trading companies, the privilege to establish colonies. Of course, this is to save the Crown money. It's a very risky venture. So they have to give them a monopoly over the trade and several other things in order to make it worthwhile for investors. So John Guy is the first to establish a colony in what's now English Canada, right? Being in Newfoundland in 1610. The existence of permanent settlements in Newfoundland would be followed by others, Bristol's Hope, Carbonear. Of course, you'd have Ferryland, or the colony of Avalon, would be started by the Kirk brothers. So, we begin to see more and more settlements as the decades progress. Of course, with that, interest from others comes to the fore, and this includes pirates, right? So besides the settlers that arrive, Newfoundland, of course, features hundreds of migratory vessels that arrive every year. They spend very little time there, only the summer, and in some cases they don't even come ashore, so they'll be weeks and months standing out to sea, filling their holds with fish and returning again. So you could have hundreds and eventually thousands of fishing vessels out on the Grand Banks at any time between, say, May, June, and August, September. These waters, these coasts, for a long time had very little in the way of state presence, okay, naval convoys, and certainly no permanent government. The rule of law was all but non-existent. And these are important things to keep in mind for this period, as well as what happens in the early 18th century as well. Until 1729, the only system of law and order was the rule of the fishing admirals. Okay? And it's essentially what that was the captain of the first fishing vessel to enter a harbor became the fishing admiral for that season. He had the best pick of the fishing room, like basically the fishing hole, like wherever he was going to fish, as well as the first choice of where he would like to locate his shore-based facilities. He also had the power to rule in any fishery matters, over any fishery disputes, and to take note, of course, of any other disputes that might have happened. So in case of conflict, he was to report this to the first naval commodore who may sail into the harbor that summer. It would take some time for that to happen. Naval convoys didn't actually take place until the 1620s. Nevertheless, so I guess what you could take away from that is these fishing admirals did possess enormous responsibility and enormous power. Of course, it was also open to abuse, as you can well imagine. And this sort of thing lasted right until 1729. Of course, the other advantage that Newfoundland held was its geography. This is the Avalon Peninsula, but if you look at the inset there, so the island of Newfoundland, there are, of course, thousands of tiny inlets and coves and bays. Plenty of areas there for which you could hide if you needed to, careen your vessel on a beach, and make needed repairs. Also, of course, to recuperate if indeed you had injuries sustained. So they were very attractive, this whole area, this whole region. These advantages are first recognized by the fellow named Peter Easton. So Cheryl had mentioned Easton's gold, In Search of Easton's Gold. Captain Peter Easton is definitely the most, I would say the most significant, certainly the most famous pirate to come out of Newfoundland, perhaps even Atlantic Canada, certainly during this early period. He was a privateer against the Spanish. When the English and Spanish actually draw up a treaty and declare an end to their war, once Elizabeth I is dead and, you know, the Spanish Armada and all that stuff, people like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins have all perished. Spain and England do come to a peace that lasts for quite some time, up until the 1620s. Captain Peter Easton, of course, he's operating in the English Channel, and once this peace takes hold, well, you know, the opportunities are very slim for taking Spanish vessels, and he begins to move down towards West Africa and operating out of what's known as the Barbary Coast, continuing to attack Spanish vessels and Portuguese vessels. And he does very well for himself. Known as the Great Easton or the Pirate Admiral, he is especially active again as he moves towards the Caribbean in 1610, 1611, eventually moves his way northwards towards the fishing grounds off what's now Nova Scotia, as well as Newfoundland. He establishes a base in Harbor Grace, which is in Conception Bay, which is just to the north of Cupid's or Cooper's Cove. And there he builds a defensive battery, a palisade, and he receives his ships of 5 ships, his fleet receives much needed repairs, of course, after cruising off West Africa and the Caribbean. He set up another base on Kelly's Island on the far side of that bay. That's not far from Bell Island, so for those of you who've been out that way in Conception Bay, next time you'll maybe have to join the other treasure hunters on Kelly's Island, the site of, as they say, many a treasure hunt. So Easton routinely plunders the fishing vessels, and he doesn't draw any distinction between the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, or the English, okay? He's very opportunistic. In St. John's Harbor, he moves in there to seek provisions and supplies and men. He takes some 25 French ships on one occasion, 12 Portuguese ships, a large Flemish vessel, and then he plunders 30 English ships that had been sheltered in that harbor. So again, not drawing any distinction between ships of these nations. In 1613, there were complaints to London by the fishing merchants, migratory, those who had invested heavily in the migratory fishery, that the pirate Easton had caused damages estimated at well over £20,000, which was a lot of money. His fleet grew to 10 ships, and he mounted something like 100 cannon, and estimates of the number of the crew under his command ran anywhere between 500 and 1,000. Now, I mean, there could be quite a bit of embellishment there, but of course, as we'll learn, that was also a pirate's best friend. Embellishment, exaggeration, this reputation for not taking prisoners, these sorts of things made their job a lot easier, right? So the less resistance, the better. His repeated visits to Cupid's became more than just a nuisance. He put in there for supplies, he put in there not necessarily to raid and to take men, but again, it was more for provisions and also to extract something in the way of protection money. So he agreed he would defend the colony against incursions by other pirates, for instance, if, of course, they paid him off. And they may have just paid him off with livestock. That being said, this is an early settlement, as all early settlements, particularly in the New World. It was very difficult and challenging, particularly in those first few years. They would not have had a lot of livestock. As far as native species to Newfoundland, I mean, hunting now is great with moose, but moose were only introduced in 1900, so that they didn't exist by this point. There were caribou, but there's very little else that they could hunt that would sustain these populations. So again, they're struggling at this time, and Peter Easton really served. He's more than just a distraction. The settlers, of course, numbering no more than about 40, with only about only about 3 cannon to their arsenal, had little choice but to cooperate with Easton. Okay. Now, for his part, Easton actually refrains from raiding Cupids. There are some other negative effects, of course, of his continued presence in Cupids, though. And perhaps these are less easy to put a dollar figure on, but Easton's visits forced Guy to remain in the colony. He had plans to extend trading relations with the native peoples of Newfoundland, the Beothuk. They had met them in 1610, a group who had been fishing in that area, and they had agreed to meet the following summer. Of course, the following summer, Peter Easton had been there, and so he had to postpone that meeting. He went out the next year to try to locate the Beothuk, and they had withdrawn from that part of the island, from that part of Conception Bay. And so there was definitely a missed opportunity there for the colony, for the Beothuk as well. Easton uses his bases in Newfoundland to raid the Spanish in the Caribbean. Upon his return one year, he hears that an official has been sent from the Crown, a Richard Whitburn, to investigate these so-called crimes, reports of piracy and accusations of harboring and encouraging piracy by both colonists and those inshore resident fishermen. And Easton actually takes them prisoner, quote unquote prisoner. Doesn't sound like much of a captivity narrative to me, but he takes them on board his ship for 11 weeks. They spend a lot of time together. Apparently they get on quite well. Whitburn's letters, his notes, describes Easton as being well furnished and very rich. And he mentions a number of times the very good treatment he received from Easton. So much so that he offers Easton an opportunity to denounce piracy. And in return for that, Richard Whitburn will write to the king and seek a pardon on Easton's behalf, which in fact he does. Now, such pardons, of course, were often arranged through monarchs and those close to the monarch, anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pounds. You could have a pardon. And to put this in perspective, a good daily wage of an Englishman at this time was between 15 and 20 pounds a year, and that's really on the high end. So, so most people, did not have the 1,000 to 2,000 pounds, and a nice watch to cover the pardon. So the pardon was eventually arranged, but not before Easton had captured 4 of Spain's treasure ships. He had to make sure he was set up before he indeed. So you can't blame the guy, I guess. His booty is estimated to have been over 2 million pounds, okay, when he finally accepts this pardon. He settles in Savoy, France. He buys a palace. He sets up an entire warehouse to store his loot, his booty. And he earns the title the Marquis of Savoy. And that's where he lives out the rest of his days, okay? So talk about a success story. And this story, of course, what this does is this serves to inspire others, right? I mean, why not? So the attraction of Newfoundland lays not in the plunder to be had there in terms of, gold and silver, seizure of boatloads of fish in itself. Of course, was not a particularly attractive prospect for any self-respecting pirate. But in the provisions and the equipment and the supplies that they could spirit away, and of course the men they could conscript into their own crews. And Easton's raid bore testimony to this. According to witnesses, Easton arrived at Newfoundland after cruising on the coast of Guinea and promptly began to extort food, sails, rigging, and men from the fishing ships operating there, okay? So that's what first brought him there in 1610, 1611. So his exploits in Newfoundland were intended to build up the strength and, of course, the intensity, I guess, of his force, where he could then move out and intercept Spanish treasure fleets further south into the Atlantic. His piratical reign was followed by that of Henry Mainwaring. Also a privateer turned pirate, Mainwaring was commissioned actually in 1611 to track Easton down. Easton, because he had, broken this truce, right, between England and Spain, he continued to attack the Spanish. England didn't want that anymore. They'd seen that earlier in the century, or the previous century, when sea dogs such as Drake and Hawkins had essentially started a war, which resulted in the Spanish Armada. They weren't interested anymore. They did not have money for another war, a prolonged war. But once Mainwaring learns of Easton's pardon, he also makes his way to Newfoundland, just to check it out, right? Just to make sure. He turns pirate. He also begins to attack Spanish vessels, but he refrains from attacking English vessels, okay? And this, because of this, it may have been overlooked for some time anyway, by the Crown. He did follow Easton's example in making Newfoundland a base, and he resettles Easton's base at Harbor Grace, refortifies it, and then begins attacking fishing vessels from non-English nations. In June 1614, his fleet of 8 ships plunder the cod fishing fleet. They take provisions, supplies, small quantities of guns and powder and shot, vessels and rigging, as well as men for their crews. Who else shows up? Well, Richard Whitburn is still there, and he also goes out on a cruise with Henry Mainwaring, again taken prisoner. He leaves Newfoundland in September. His holds are filled with supplies and ships. He's manned with about 400 able sailors taken from the fishing fleets, and he sails to the coast of Spain to take ships there, including Portuguese ships and French ships. And Mainwaring, as I say, returns to raiding the Spanish vessels and coastal communities until he's offered a pardon. By that point, Richard Whitburn had written on his behalf to seek a pardon from James I, and he gets that. And he's also offered a pardon from the Spanish crown. Please stop what you're doing. So, he receives both. He receives 2 pardons. He's made his money now. He settles back home in Dover. He's actually made an MP of Dover. Some things never change, right? And in 1616, he publishes a discourse on piracy. He's the first Englishman to do that, but he publishes a discourse on piracy again And this could have been part of his pardon as well, as he agreed that he would divulge all his secrets, right, and help them solve this problem. So his discourse of the beginnings, practices, and suppression of pirates, right? And in it, he describes the causes for why a desperate man would turn pirate, okay? Poor pay and working conditions, particularly among the fishing laborers, were partly to blame. Okay, it made the island ideal for recruitment. Henry Mainwaring noted that pirates easily get bread and cider, ale, and fish enough, with all necessities from shipping. In Newfoundland, if they be of good force, they'll command all the land, as the fishermen will not stand with each other, right? They will not, again, come together to defend the island or defend their ships even. Why? Because they're not paid enough to do so. They're certainly not given any kind of protections, any kind of benefits, right? Nor are they really given the training to do so. He claimed that Newfoundland was perhaps even better than the west of Ireland, which was held as sort of the nursery for pirates. And he believes that Newfoundland outdistanced Ireland. Again, because of the numbers of vessels that were out on the Grand Banks, the numbers of sailors, able sailors, right, who were working those vessels, because of the provisions and the stores they carried. Food and men were abundant. There were fewer naval vessels in the region of the Grand Banks than just about anywhere else in the world. And many of the local inhabitants were willing to at least maybe even turn the other cheek, or even to openly sort of enable, I guess, or facilitate piracy from the island. Despite this appeal, though, piracy at Newfoundland gradually fades. As we near the middle of the 17th century, several developments are responsible for that. Most noticeable are measures that are taken by England to protect and regulate the fisheries. There's a state navy in 1649. Oliver Cromwell, the English Civil War, won't get into all that, but Cromwell's Western design involves expanding England into the Caribbean and having a toehold in the Caribbean, which they do when they attack Jamaica in 1655, okay? And from Jamaica, Port Royal in particular, the English have a base with which they can attack Spain, raid Spain, right there within the New World, the Spanish Main. So this, of course, attracts a lot of recruits as well. There are escort vessels that are being sent to Newfoundland, station ships. They would only be there as long as the migratory fishery was being conducted, so between, say, May and September. The authorities in London didn't perceive Newfoundland to be an overseas possession like that of its other colonies. One official would explain Newfoundland was seen more as a great English ship moored near the banks during the fishing season for the convenience of the English fishermen, right? So in a migratory fishery, there'd be nothing left there once the fishermen moved back to England. The capital investment, the labor force, the entire production of the fishery was all abandoned in the island. The expense of fixed fortifications as well as a standing navy or a permanent garrison, of course, was not justified in such a place. The Committee of the Privy Council accordingly concluded in 1675 that these sorts of things were, like fortifications, were unnecessary. It's needless to have any such defense against foreigners, the coast being defended in the winter by the ice, which would sometimes last until June, right? It's defended in summer, again, by those naval convoys. The permanent population at the time was less than 2,000 and so widely dispersed, all these different bays, that no fortifications were justified, nor would they be effective anyway by reasons of the distance of the harbors. Okay? So this is a cost-benefit analysis, obviously, seemed to make sense. And as I say, most of those pirates, or those people who were attacking Spanish shipping ranged further south, right, once England had a base, as I say, in Jamaica. England becomes embroiled in a series of wars against the Dutch and then against the French. And this makes sea raiding a legitimate pursuit for many. So we wouldn't call it piracy because now they receive a license to go out and commit piracy, right? A letter of marque. They become privateers. So legitimate piracy, right? And they apply for those letters of marque, and of course, the crown gets a share of the profits, right? As long as you're attacking the enemy. Okay? But it's in the aftermath of these wars that we see a sharp and dramatic revival of piracy. Okay? The War of the Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, rages from 1702 to 1713. England and France are at it once again. And these wars have a very heavy toll on the fishery and, of course, the settlements, as well as the migratory fishery, but the settlements in Newfoundland as well. Its settlements had been attacked by the French in overland and by sea several times. Most of the English shore in Newfoundland had been sacked and burned. The only holdout had been Carbonear. And of course, the entire fishery, as I said, had been severely disrupted. Annual supply ships had been reduced in regularity, which meant that regular supplies of provisions and other badly needed equipment was slow in coming. It was certainly unpredictable, and this drives up the cost of living in Newfoundland, places like Newfoundland. Okay? Credit dependency and debt become increasingly characteristic for the residents living in Newfoundland. Many find themselves stranded there, unable to return home or unable to afford passage home, yet with no resources by which to support themselves. Adding to their woes, in 1711 was a decline in the cod fishery. The fish had refused to come ashore or close enough in. I guess sounds familiar as well. The fishery, the take in 1711 was less than half that it had been in a regular year. It gets worse in 1712. It's the most unproductive season to date by that point. Countless merchants go bankrupt, and many planters, so those resident fishermen, were irretrievably in debt. Many servants were stranded in Newfoundland, and the only way out was to jump aboard a New England coasting vessel, and New England vessels regularly plied Newfoundland, as well as Canso, Nova Scotia, in the 1680s and 90s and 1700s. They actually did perform very worthwhile services because you didn't always have convoys, and they actually did defend some of these settlements, but they also kept them sustained with provisions and goods. Of course, they also spirited away these men at the end of the year as well and brought them back to New England. Those who remained, of course, become very receptive to the idea of turning pirate. So in the years between the end of the war in 1713 and 1716, some 4,500 to 5,500 men turned pirate, go upon the account. Employment was widespread. So as soon as these wars were over, and these wars had gone on, by the way, for most of the past sort of 80 years, I think there was only 4 years of peace between 1689 and 1713. Okay? So this had been a way of life. People had been privateering most of their adult lives. Letters of marque, once the treaty was signed, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, those letters of marque, of course, were up, terminated. Okay? To go along with that, of course, the Royal Navy started dumping salaries, right? Naval seamen, sailors, were let go overnight, demobilized. The Navy was. So there was a massive labor surplus. The Royal Navy again reduced from about 50,000 in 1713 to just 13,000 a couple of years later. And by 1725, they were down to 6,000 from 50,000. Unemployed privateersmen, of course, added to this. Men such as Blackbeard, for instance, who had served as a privateer with the Royal Navy. He turned to piracy, as many others did. Wartime wages fell. They went from £4 a month to £1 a month. There was much abuse as well. Again, there was a labor surplus, so there was a lot of cheating men out of their wages, rations. There was also an increase in sort of harsh discipline aboard ship. Okay? So all of this served to leave many feeling hopeless and desperate, and motivation for turning pirate was on the upswing, shall we say. One observer warned that such usage breeds discontents and makes them eager for any change. So these jarring social and economic effects that followed the end of the war also left many seeking revenge. They were bitter towards their merchant captains, right, for treating them so poorly. Pirates, of course, normally gravitated to those very lucrative trading lanes of the Caribbean and South America. Places like New Providence in the Bahamas, Nassau, takes off overnight. Certainly by 1715, it becomes a pirate haven. A real hot spot, and some of the most renowned pirates, including Blackbeard and people like Charles Vane, people like Calico Jack Rackham and Anne Bonny, they all make their way to New Providence Island, at least for a few years anyway. That said, Newfoundland does not remain immune to this revival. As soon as piracy ends up becoming a problem again by 1716, 1717, there are merchants in Newfoundland petitioning the government for protection from pirates that are operating off their shores. In February of 1717, a petition was heard in London from the merchants of Bidford in England, requesting that a warship be sent to cruise the waters between Trepassey and St. Peter's, which is the island of St. Pierre, Miquelon, right, which is now French, to protect the trade against pirates. So why the renewed interest? Again, the cargoes taken from most fishing vessels were not in themselves worth much. Supply ships for Newfoundland, of course, were loaded with cargoes vitally important to survival at sea for weeks and months. For example, ships from Poole in 1714 were carrying to Newfoundland clothing such as cotton goods, hats, stockings, leatherware, and woolen goods. They also had on board oats and bread and pork, wheat, peas, bacon, cabbage, and of course there's cordage and nails and other hardware. The other thing, of course, is these vessels were very lightly defended. By 1717, provisions and supplies, of course, are also becoming very difficult for even those operating in the Caribbean, places like New Providence, to secure. And that's because on September 5th, 1717, the Crown actually decides to do something to curb piracy in the Caribbean, in the New World. It's a very different world now. These pirates aren't operating in the service of the Crown. They've become a nuisance, to say the least. The decision is made that we have to stamp out pirates altogether. So what happens is King George I issues a proclamation for the suppression of piracy. And he offers pirates a pardon, as long as they take it within the year, a pardon for all crimes committed. He also steps up anti-pirate operations. They create anti-piracy or pirate hunting squadrons in the New World. Places like Virginia and the Carolinas, as well as the Caribbean islands. All along Massachusetts, New York, and Bermuda. And this results within just a few years of the capture and the trial and the execution of most of those most notorious pirates of this golden age. People like Blackbeard and Calico Jack Rackham, right? And Charles Vane. The most notorious pirate to operate in Newfoundland was Bartholomew Roberts, a.k.a. Black Bart. Although no one ever called him Black Bart to his face, this was a moniker that was attached to him posthumously. He's thought to be one of the most successful pirates in the history of piracy. Certainly in this part of the world, or Newfoundland, in Atlantic Canada, he took some 40 to 50 ships and hundreds of smaller craft. Though Captain Kidd and Blackbeard are perhaps much more famous or infamous, Bartholomew Roberts actually took more ships than both of them combined. He began his career as a pirating officer aboard a slave ship. He was a ship's carpenter. He was pressed into service when his vessel was taken by a pirate under the leadership of Howell Davis. He obviously took to the life because within a few months, Howell Davis is dead. He was ambushed by the Portuguese, and Bartholomew Roberts is elected captain. His first act as captain, and this guy had a temper, was to sail back to where his captain had been ambushed and raze that settlement to the ground, kill everybody there. He then set out westward to the coast of Brazil and the West Indies, terrorizing all he encountered until the resistance stiffened in the form of anti-pirate squadrons that were put together by the English governor at Barbados and the French governor at Martinique. Remember, England and France now are no longer at war, and they begin to combine operations against the pirates that are active in the Caribbean. And they resolve to hunt him down. So he's eager for some safe haven, and where does he move towards, of course, but the east coast, what's now Canada, up towards Canso, Nova Scotia, and eventually Newfoundland. The Boston Newsletter, a very useful source for accounts. It's the first continuously published newspaper in British North America. Begins in 1704. And this entry on the 22nd of August, 1720, contains a lengthy account of an attack in Newfoundland on Trepassey Harbor by the pirate Roberts. So I'll just point to the bottom here. From thence this spring with 45 men, he came to Newfoundland. So he's talking about Bartholomew Roberts, into the harbor of Trepassey, with drums beating, trumpets sounding, and other instruments of music. Now, I should mention this was all part of his approach, his strategy. He actually carried a band on board his ship. Yeah. Those of you who have been to Newfoundland, of course, I'm sure you've all had we've got a rich history, of course, of music. And maybe it begins here, I'm not sure, but he carries a band, and again, he does that again to frighten those people in the harbor, to certainly announce their arrival and to strike fear again into the hearts of those fishermen. The rest of the article goes on to describe what he, in fact, does. And how he conducts himself and how his crew conducts himself, how they make their way through the vessels. And he eventually comes upon French fishing vessels, which he sinks and destroys most of them. He only takes one of those. In 1720, there were only 2 warships, an aging 4th rate and a 6th rate. Which was the smallest, of course, in its class. And it was then normal practice for these vessels to basically stay put in a harbor. Even in Placentia, where one of them was stationed, it usually was there just to supervise the inshore fishery and did not make its way out to the Grand Banks. So consequently, over a 2-week period, Roberts, when he's at Trepassey, doesn't encounter any warships. Again, communication, of course, is very weak between the communities because of the distances. There's no overland trail between Placentia and these communities. And he can rule over Trepassey and the Grand Banks with relative immunity. He doesn't appear to have caused much destruction of the settlements. He leaves them more or less alone, but he treats Newfoundland much as Peter Easton did, and that's more of a service center, a vast chandler's shop, fully stocked with provisions, supplies, and stores. Although valuables and alcohol, of course, were always heavily desired items, water, provisions, and new recruits, new crewmen, of course, were of more immediate concern. Roberts, to point out, had a flair for showmanship. He dressed lavishly, and this really becomes a stereotype. Think of, Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean. And there are descriptions of him, many descriptions of him, dressing in a rich crimson waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a gold chain around his neck with a diamond cross hanging from it, a sword in his hand, and 2 pair of pistols slung over his shoulders. Apparently, though, he did not drink, which was not stereotypical, and he was apparently quite religious, and he tried on several occasions to press clergymen to sail with him, to preach daily sermons, and I suppose to help towards discipline on board ship. But this attack on Piracy was heard far and wide. The French governor at Louisbourg, where the French had a settlement after 1713, he was very fearful of Roberts coming, and he was put on high alert. Roberts didn't risk attacking the fortress, but he did take several French fishing fleets, burning them and apparently torturing their crews. Following this summer, he sails on down towards the Caribbean to take care of some unfinished business. He had a hate-on, of course, for the governors of Barbados and Martinique. This is his new flag. This is his old flag. His new flag now has possibly him standing on 2 skulls. One is the skull, I guess, of the governor of Barbados, and the other one of Martinique. He does encounter a French vessel, and that French vessel does carry the new governor of Martinique. And he summarily executes that governor, apparently hanging him from the bowsprit of his own vessel. I think what that story points to is that, piracy, it had always been very violent and cruel, but now this had really overstepped, and both the English and the French put to sea anti-pirate squadrons, but whose task was really to track down Roberts. And his luck would run out. His luck ran out not long after that. In February 1722, off the coast of West Africa, he was tracked down, and he was killed in battle. The remnants of his crew were taken to Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana, and they were tried and executed in a mass hanging, pretty well ended. He was one of the last remaining pirates, notorious pirates operating at that time. That said, he had captured some 400 prizes. Many of those, of course, came from the waters of Newfoundland and Atlantic Canada. The last person I'll mention is just a minute, is that piracy persisted in Newfoundland, although its days were certainly numbered. And one of the last instances was this John Phillips. And he had been a member of a fish-splitting crew in Petty Harbor, Newfoundland. And he and some of his fellow splitters in August of 1723 stole a schooner and headed out to the Grand Banks and ended up taking a few smaller French and English craft. They made their way to the West Indies. They spent the winter down there, and then they were being chased, essentially. In need of recruits and provisions, they moved their way northwards again. They attack a few vessels from New England. What they do then, of course, ends up to be their downfall. They press those men into service, and this just sort of shows that the world had changed a lot. This North Atlantic, New England, Newfoundland were no longer ideal places to recruit anymore. These sailors, in the end, rebelled and overtook him and his crew. They killed Phillips. They took the ship back into Boston Harbor, and there's a very well-publicized trial and execution of his men. So by then, the resurgence of piracy in Newfoundland, as elsewhere, had reached its climax. The Admiralty had 3 warships. patrolling the banks. The French also sent 2 or 3 warships to patrol the banks. Such measures and actions certainly had a devastating effect. By 1726, piracy in Newfoundland certainly does not appear to be a serious problem. Naval campaigns, vigorous naval campaigns, the well-publicized deaths of such people as Black Bart, and John Phillips as well, and the introduction of harsh laws to criminalize both those convicted of piracy, but also those who were complicit in it, right? So if you were an official or a member of the Royal Navy or a resident fisherman and you were thought to have conspired with pirates, you would also face very serious punishment. And that really lessens the appeal of piracy, as you can appreciate. So with piracy disappearing elsewhere, Newfoundland's role as a service center fades as well. Formal state authority in 1723 in St. John's. 1723, you have naval commodores, you have a court of law that's established. In 1729, a year-round governor is resident in St. John's to institute a system of civil administration. By the mid-1720s, the fishery had recovered, the island's population began to grow again, and the reasons for the island's attractiveness as a nursery for pirates no longer existed. So, as short as it was, and of course now with the passage of time here in the 21st century, because we're so distant, of course, from the devastation wrought by pirates, the tales, the exploits of pirates now are said to put the fun in Newfoundland. Right? Thank you very much. Thank you for being a great audience.